Please join me in prayer. Holy Spirit, may you come into our lives from the four corners, into our lives where things seem barren and dry. Knit us back together, bone to bone, and give us new life. Amen. So today we're going to look at these passages from Ezekiel and from Paul in Romans. And I want to look at these paired themes that I saw in these texts of life and death, spirit and flesh. And I want to just look at how those themes come out in the texts. And then we're going to look for those things reflected in the world around us, because I think that we can see a lot of that around us right now. First, in our reading from Ezekiel, what is the Spirit of God in the reading from Ezekiel? The Spirit of God is what takes up Ezekiel and what shows him in stark terms the truth of life and death, the truth of loss that he and his people were experiencing during the time he was called upon to prophesy. It shows this truth to him in the Valley of Dry Bones, using that imagery. And then in the midst of that Valley of Dry Bones, the Spirit is also what gives him hope. And what gives him hope that he can then offer to his people. The Spirit of God is what says, prophesy, and tell these bones that they will live. And then as Ezekiel watches, the bones all come together in this rattling chorus, and flesh covers them, and they rise up. And then the breath of life comes to them, and they live. And then that same Spirit says to Ezekiel, now prophesy to my people, and tell them that they too will live again. And that is what enables Ezekiel to do so in the midst of their time, which was a time of dry bones, when they were saying that their life had gone from them and their hope had dried up. In our text from Romans, for Paul, the Spirit of God is the presence of God. And it's the presence of God specifically that redeems the flesh. Paul always likes to compare and contrast flesh and spirit in that dichotomy, through which he understands a lot of the world and which sort of is behind a lot of his theology. And so for Paul, the Spirit of God is the presence of God that redeems the flesh. And when it redeems the flesh, one of the ways you know is that it enables a person to set their mind on life, even in the midst of death, and to be at peace. So those are some of the ways that spirit and flesh, life and death, come out in our texts. And I don't think it's difficult to see how these things are playing out in the world around us. And I'm going to have a couple of key examples of this. The first on the negative side. The first is an example of someone having their eyes on death in the midst of life. In and amongst a group of people, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, among others, has been making an explicit call. And that call is for us to sacrifice people in order to benefit the economy. This is often something people talk around, or they might approach obliquely or tangentially, but in this case it's been interesting because people have been saying explicitly that we should sacrifice people in order to benefit the economy, to get it looking numerically the way that we want it to look. Now when we talk about the economy, we're usually not talking about the poor and the vulnerable people around us. Economic reports are rarely about them. Economic benefits rarely make it to them. In fact, in this case, the poor and the vulnerable are explicitly the sacrifices. Because if we say we are going to sacrifice some people to benefit the economy, then that some people who will first be sacrificed are people who are old, people who are chronically ill, people who are vulnerable to sickness, often due to things like poverty. So it isn't for their benefit that this sacrifice would happen. They are the sacrifices for the benefit of, presumably, the rest of us. It's even presented, or could be presented, in pseudo-Christian terms. I mean, what could be more Christian than for some people to die for the sake of other people? What could be more Christian than to give your life for someone else? And so surely we can sacrifice some vulnerable people so that we can give life to Halliburton, or Royal Caribbean, or Viacom CBS. Let some die so that they can live. When Paul uses the word flesh, he means this. When Paul uses the word flesh, this is exactly what he means. This kind of reasoning, this kind of calculus, where we give up the vulnerable for the sake of prosperity. In fact, if you read the prophets in the Old Testament, Ezekiel's valley of dry bones is the literal result of this kind of reasoning. The prophets continually said, you cannot abandon the poor for your own benefit. If you do that, you will be destroyed. The people continued to do that, and so they were destroyed. And in the aftermath of that destruction, the people are a valley of dry bones, with no life or no hope in them. This is the aftermath, to be explicit, of human sacrifice on the altar of mammon. We can also see examples of people with their minds set on life, even in the midst of death. You may recognize the name Don Giuseppe Berardelli. He was the archpriest of a town in northern Italy, and he died a couple of weeks ago. The reason that he died is that he had COVID-19, and he was in the hospital. And because he's a prominent person, an archpriest of an entire town, he was offered a ventilator. And he refused that ventilator so that it could go to someone younger than him, a stranger, so that that person could live. Don Berardelli was widely liked by the people in his town. He would greet everyone with the words pace e bene, peace and goodwill. And he would motor around on his little red motorcycle through the town in northern Italy where he was the archpriest. And you always knew that Don Berardelli, if you had a problem and you came to him, he would do all he could to help you. And he was described as a person who is ever cheerful. And when it came to his time to decide where his mind would be set, I think that he showed his quality. For me, it's hard to think of a better single example of a person whose mind is focused on life in the midst of death, a person whose flesh has been redeemed by the Spirit. And the contrast for me could not be a bigger one, even though these two cases could seem similar on the surface. Don Berardelli did not say, "Go, my child, and live so that you can create larger dividends for stockholders." Instead, he said, "Pace e bene," peace and goodwill, and gave his life for another. During this time of peace and of life and death, of spirit and flesh, we are called to have our eyes on life in the midst of death, both literal death and symbolic death. We are seeing and experiencing deaths in the form of unwanted changes in our lives, in the form of lost jobs, in the form of ended careers, in the form of canceled vacations. In many forms, we experience these symbolic deaths. The death of separation and loneliness during this time of social distancing. We are also experiencing, of course, the literal death of a growing number of fellow human beings. And so it's our calling as people with the Spirit of Christ within us to offer peace and goodwill. Not to abandon the vulnerable so that the healthy and the strong can prosper, but in fact the exact opposite. To use our strength and our help and our health to protect the vulnerable. That's why we are staying home, even though many of us are still healthy. The reason we are doing that is to use our health to protect the vulnerable people around us. In fact, tomorrow, we're recording this on Saturday. Tomorrow on Sunday, as far as the governor is concerned, we could gather and worship together in person. Churches are considered essential. And so if we chose, there is nothing stopping us from gathering. Nothing legally stopping us. What's stopping us is our willingness to use our health to protect the vulnerable. Both the vulnerable people in our own congregation who couldn't come if we did gather. I mean, if we gathered, we'd be missing a lot of people right now. But also the vulnerable people around us. People we may or may not even know, strangers to us. And we're doing this because it's our calling during this time. Pace e bene. For the sake of vulnerable people. Pace e bene. As the natural world around us is breathing sighs of relief. Pace e bene. Life amidst death. Flesh redeemed by the Spirit. So that we can leave this valley of dry bones in time and go forward to future hope.